All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So, we are going to continue our discussion on animal behavior today by really actually starting to pick up on learned behaviors. So, up to this point, we've been talking about more or less things that at least have some component of innate behavior, something you're born with, something you have the instinct to know how to do. But now we're moving into spatial learning as well as other forms of learning, which really are very much based on experience. So when we talk about spatial learning, we're looking at your book defines it as this complex modification of behavior based on experience with spatial structures. So how does the organism associate certain landmarks with something of interest, whether it's their nest, its food, its mating area, something dangerous, regardless. Um, and think about it, we as humans do plenty of spatial learning, right? You learn where different objects are located in your home. Perhaps you remember being a freshman walking into the high school for the first time and you're needing to figure out where your classes are. You're driving for the first time and trying to figure out where certain locations are of interest to you, the grocery store, your best friend's house, your boyfriend's house, whatever the case might be, right? Um, you grow up, you go to college, you're going to be learning all sorts of new spatial learning too as well. So we are very much dependent on spatial learning. Not every organism is. This is something that is definitely unique to certain species. Um, but think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, it certainly increases your fitness as an individual if this is something you're capable of doing, which means you survive longer, which means you have the capacity to potentially reproduce longer. So it's definitely an evolutionary benefit. The diagram here in the picture is talking about these digger wasps, and they specifically, in this experiment, were testing whether or not these guys do, in fact, participate in spatial learning by producing these sort of pine cone rings around their nests. Well, clearly, based on the results, these digger wasps do in fact use spatial landmarks to determine where things like their nests are located, because the experimenters took ahead and moved that pine cone ring, and all of a sudden the digger wasp had no idea where their nest was. So we certainly do this all of the time. Uh, as insects, certain species of insects, and again, we as humans definitely do as well. So cognitive mapping is kind of what's going on in the brains of these organisms, being able to take internal representations of spatial relationships, right? So how do I know how far I need to go to get to point A to point B, and then back to sort of home base? And some organisms are definitely better than others at this. Some of them don't do it at all. Think about it, even as humans, some of us are really good at knowing what 3 miles looks like, and the rest of us are just like, yeah, okay, sure. Um, so this particular diagram came from a nuthatch experiment where they were able to sort of trace certain landmarks so that the organisms were capable of finding food sources and also still being able to get back home. So, based on this particular set of data, they were able to determine that yes, in fact, nuthatches do create sort of these internal maps so that they can find these areas of interest for themselves. So associative learning. So here we're talking about these ideas of classic versus operant conditioning. If you've ever taken a psychology class or you do sometime in the future, um, Skinner, Pavlov, these guys are going to come up. We're going to talk really briefly about them here today. But what we're dealing with when we talk about associative learning is animals that associate a certain feature in their environment with something else. And so let's sort of dig into these two types of conditioning to see what that really means. So, classical conditioning, Pavlov's dog is the classic example of classical conditioning. It's taking an associative learning approach by taking some sort of arbitrary stimulus, so something that really means nothing, but associating it with some sort of reward or punishment. So, in the case of Pavlov, he did this with dogs to train them to actually salivate. Um, And this takes conditioning in the sense that you need to do this in multiple steps. So, how does this basic thing work? Well, we take our dog, we show them food, and their natural, unconditioned response is to salivate. So, produce that saliva so that when they eat that food, they can start breaking it down and being able to digest it. That's just a natural reaction. Pavlov took what you would call a neutral stimulus, in this case, a bell. And if you rung the bell, the dog is just like, yep, cool, okay, whatever. And there's no salivation, which is going to be the response that we're ultimately looking for. So the conditioning part here is taking the dog and getting the dog to associate food and bell at the same time. And so that's what this conditioning process is right here. So every time he would ring the bell, he'd bring the food, and the dog would naturally salivate at the sight of the food. You do this long enough, and you can then eventually, after the conditioning is in fact in place, be able to remove that unconditioned stimulus, in this case the food. He rings the bell and the dog salivates without actually needing to see the food, because that dog has now learned to associate that noise with food being presented.
In this video, we'll introduce very basic concepts in classical conditioning by simulating Pavlov's experiments with dogs. Now you may be wondering, if I'm going to be dealing with human beings, why am I looking at a dog? The answer is that the same principles of behaviorism that apply to higher order animals also apply to us humans. So when it comes to classical conditioning, we aren't that much different from Rover here. We're presenting Rover with a stimulus here, a bell. When we ring the bell, there's no response in Rover. That's because dogs, just like human beings, are not naturally wired to have a response to a bell. Without conditioning, there is no response. Therefore, we call the bell a neutral stimulus. I can ring the bell repeatedly with no response from Rover. Next, we'll introduce Rover to a new stimulus, the sight of food and water. Rover's natural response to the sight of food and water is to salivate. He wasn't conditioned to have this reaction. It's natural, innate, or inborn, and automatic, not taught, not conditioned. So this stimulus is called an unconditioned stimulus, and Rover's response is called an unconditioned response. Next, we'll simulate Pavlov's experiment. We'll ring the bell, and then present Rover with food and water. Rover salivates, not because of the bell, which is a neutral stimulus, but because of the food, the unconditioned stimulus. Now we're going to repeat this process. If we repeatedly ring the bell before presenting Rover with food, he'll be conditioned to respond to the bell. Now Rover will salivate upon hearing the bell, even in the absence of food. This response has been conditioned. It's now a conditioned response, and the bell has become a conditioned stimulus. So, to recap, the bell started out as a neutral stimulus. The food was an unconditioned stimulus. When Rover salivated upon seeing the food, it was an unconditioned response. When we repeatedly paired the sound of the bell with the sight of food, Rover was finally conditioned to salivate upon hearing the bell. The bell has now become a conditioned stimulus for Rover, and salivating to the sound of the bell is a conditioned response in Rover. Behavioral theory tells us that our behaviors have been shaped or conditioned by past experiences in much the same way that Rover has been conditioned to salivate upon hearing that bell, and therefore behavior modification is possible through conditioning.
Operant conditioning, on the other hand, similar idea. It's still another type of associated learning, but now the animal learns to associate its own behaviors with some sort of reward or punishment. And to be fair, go sit in an elementary classroom, go watch parents with young children. Adults do this to children all the time. All right, so we get you to learn that if you are a good student and you sit in your chair and you are quiet, you get stickers, right? Or you get enough stickers and you go ahead and you get to pick from the prize box. My son will be going through potty training shortly, and this is definitely something that they recommend when you're potty training. Kid sits on the potty, get a reward. Kid eventually uses the bathroom, give an award. And the idea here is the more and more you get that behavior and they associate that behavior with the reward, eventually you can pull the reward back, right? And not give it as often. It doesn't necessarily have to happen every single time, and the behavior theoretically should continue. We're talking about this in the sense of sort of more animal behavior as opposed to human behavior, not that we're not animals, but B.F. Skinner is really the one who was the sort of proponent of operant conditioning, specifically with rats. Um, and in his case, he would get the rats to associate pushing a lever with learning that that lever would provide them with food. So, what they call Skinner's box. What we see this going on in nature all the time often happens with animals and food sources. So, a predator may learn to specifically avoid certain types of prey because of some sort of painful experience. So, the picture here with the blue jay eats a monarch butterfly. Monarchs are poisonous by nature of the fact that they feed on the milkweed, which contains harmful compounds. The bird eats the monarch, doesn't kill him, but he does get really, really sick. And so the more he does that, the more he learns to associate that orange and black color pattern to something that he doesn't want to eat because he doesn't want to get sick after the fact.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you at work.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
No, Sheldon, you can't train my girlfriend like a lab rat.
Actually, it turns out I can.
Well, you shouldn't.
There's just no pleasing you, is there, Leonard? You weren't happy with my previous approach to dealing with her, so I decided to employ operant conditioning techniques, building on the works of Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Yet by this time next week, I believe I can have her jumping out of a pool, balancing a beach ball on her nose.
No, this has to stop now.
I'm not suggesting we really make her jump out of a pool. I thought the bazinga was implied. I'm just tweaking her personality, just sanding off the rough edges, if you will.
No, you're not sanding Penny.
Are you saying that I am forbidden from applying a harmless, scientifically valid protocol that will make our lives better?
Yes, you're forbidden.
Bad, Leonard. You know, using positive reinforcement techniques, I could train that behavior out of her in a week.
No.
If you let me use negative reinforcement, I can get done before we go to bed.
You're not squirting her in the face with water.
No, of course not. We're talking very mild electric shocks. No tissue damage whatsoever.
Forget it.
Oh, come on. You can't tell me that you're not intrigued about the possibility of building a better girlfriend.
I'm not. Penny's qualities, both good and bad, are what make her who she is.
You mean like that high-pitched, irritating laugh?
Yes.
You wouldn't prefer a throaty chuckle?
You're not changing how Penny laughs.
No, that would be incongruous. No, I was going to lower the whole voice to a more pleasing register.
Sorry, guys. That girl is freaky.
Come again?
Freaky.
Freaky?
Yeah, freaky.
Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to make some warm milk and then turn in. I trust if you two are planning on engaging in amorous activities, you'll keep the decibel level to a minimum.
Of course.
Thank you.
These are so good.
Unbelievable.
Here's the other interesting thing. So we talk about associative learning, and this term habituation comes up, and it's a loss of response to a particular stimulus. Behavioral ecologists may refer to this as a cry-wolf effect. It's actually decreasing a natural response to a repeated occurrence of the same stimulus. So the example here is the falling leaves don't trigger a fear response in baby birds. Think about this from an evolutionary standpoint. Those falling leaves are not going to be detrimental to the welfare of those birds, right? So the more that those babies come in contact with those falling leaves and realize that it's not harmful, they don't elicit a fear response, which is a good thing, right? If you had to respond to every stimuli in your environment every day, 24 hours a day, you'd expend so much energy, you'd have no time to do anything else. It would be exhausting and unnecessary. So we learn through experience to lessen the responses to certain stimuli because those stimuli aren't something that is either really beneficial or really harmful to us. And so we conserve energy to not have to worry about that particular stimulus. So it inadvertently increases our survival and reproduction because we now have more time and energy to spend foraging for food, finding mates, or just reacting to real dangerous situations instead.